how do you know where to put that on the pole? It looks like you have the counterweight down there. I think you may have answered it because I've been talking to people, but if you
Sure.
haven't, clarify it.
So the counterweight, this is going to come with trial and error. You need to balance your weight so this isn't like, you see how now I'm not going to like let go completely, but you can see how the camera is like dropping substantially. If you drop this weight, now you can see it's much more gradual. And that's what you want. You want that weight to, you want the camera to swing a little bit. You want the camera to be east heavy, that weight to be on the east side of the mount. So here we're polar aligned, right? And east is to our essentially right if you're looking north. And so you want this camera weight to be on that side. So the worm gear in the mount is always engaged with the teeth of the RA gear. And how high this needs to be will depend on the weight of your camera, your lens, all of that. That it's just going to take, a little faith and a little practice. Don't let your camera swing crazy because it'll just, it'll crash down. You could hit your tripod and bad stuff happens when you let go of cameras. Don't let go of your camera. So for me, I have to bring this weight pretty far down because I have this geared head and then also the pano head on top of that. But now you can see there is a little bit of give towards the east, and that's perfectly normal. That's what you want. But you just don't want this dropping off really fast, rapidly. All right, so the weight distribution is pretty good. Now I'm gonna, again, hand tight this. If you're going crazy with RA clutch, you're just gonna screw up your polar alignment. Just hand tight it. Doesn't have to be super bad. Make sure everything, all of your latitude knob, it's not like, freely wobbling around. Make sure your azimuth bolts are, again, tight. Make sure these little screws are tight. And then you're ready to align your field of view. At this point, it's probably a good idea just to check your polar alignment. If you're using a wide angle lens, like a 20 millimeter, 24 millimeter, your polar alignment doesn't have to be perfect. Even if, Polaris, if you look at the app and you're like, oh, Polaris needs to be at 10 o'clock and it needs to be in this portion of the ring. If you're at this point, if you're not dead on 10 o'clock, if it's like maybe 11 or 12 or, Polaris is a little outside the ring or a little inside the ring, that's fine. It's not going to matter. If you're shooting at like 85 millimeters, 135 millimeters, you got to be dead on. Can't be missing that polar alignment. And you can see my wedge isn't totally tight. All right, so we've got it polar aligned. We have all of our gear kind of a little bit east heavy. Now, why do I have this ridiculous three-way head? For the longest time, I was using a ball head, and I really struggled at getting clean landscape panoramas. So with a ball head, I should have brought my ball head. I don't know why I didn't. With a ball head, you'll loosen it, right? And you basically have a freely moving camera that just kind of flops around. With the three-way geared head, what I do is there are levels on all three axes, and I make sure that ultimately the top axis on this three-way head is in the bubble level. And so now I have a nice flat, either horizontal for landscape or more vertical for portrait mode camera orientation. And then I can adjust my pano head very carefully, just rotate it around, and now I'm ready to take my exposure. I've looked through the viewfinder and I'm like, okay, that looks pretty good. And my pano head has hash marks here for the degrees. Every hash mark I think is 9 or 10 degrees. Okay. And so This is so absurd. This took me so long to figure out. I'll take like a 2 minute exposure, right? And your mount is rotating. And so over time, what's going to happen is this bubble level will become unlevel. And so usually it depends on my exposure time, but I shoot for 2 minute exposures, maybe 3 minutes if it's a really dark location. I'll take an exposure, it'll be 2 minutes. After that exposure, all I have to do is loosen the pano head. I know with my lens how many hash marks I have to rotate this head. Lock it down, and then I start my next exposure. Now, after like the second or third exposure, the level will become unleveled enough. All I have to do is just rotate this geared head, in one direction, and then it'll be back to level. And then again, I repeat this process for however many exposures. My pano head, in this case, has a vertical adjustment, so I can loosen this screw, and if I need to do 2 rows, I can raise the camera up a little bit, tighten that down. Same thing, just loosen the head, rotate it, and you just got to watch, your bubble level. Make sure things aren't flopping around. It's not too unlevel. If you wait too long and this becomes, out of level, you'll notice that the weight distribution is now off, and your camera will flop around a little bit. The tracking will become inconsistent.
If setup is east heavy and setup rotates past 12 o'clock during exposure series, the camera becomes west heavier.
Yep.
Are you likely to run into backlash at this point?
Yes. So, when you're dealing with telescopes, this is the unfortunate thing with these portable mounts, is you have to be aware of that. When you're dealing with a telescope, telescope control programs, like with my mount that I use my laptop with, they have a trigger. The mount will know when it's gone beyond 12 o'clock, and the mount will flip. It's called a meridian flip. It passes that meridian, which is 12, and so it says, okay, I'm going to flip the telescope around so everything stays east heavy. Unfortunately, with these, you don't really have that option, so you have to be aware of that. And then your options are, so let's say it becomes a little west heavy here. You can move this counterweight up or down a little bit, tighten it down, and then your counterweight will then become east heavy. You just have to pay attention to that. If you go past 12, you either need to loosen the counterweight and lift or raise it so it stays east heavy, or you need to actually slide the whole bracket. And that's I would not slide the whole bracket because you're probably going to screw up your polar alignment. I would first try adjusting the counterweight, a little bit down, and then it'll be east heavy. It'll pull the mount towards the east. Does it make sense why I use this 3-way head? So, when you do panoramas and you have a ball head attached to either your declination bracket in the case of the Star Adventure, or the mount itself in the case of like an Ioptron Sky Tracker, the problem you encounter is that the ball head can't rotate and keep a horizontal camera. Eventually what's going to happen is that when you rotate around the RA axis, the ball head's going to bang into the edge of the ball head itself, the thing that holds the ball. And so when you go to try and, you're trying to take a panorama, and you're holding it like this, and the ball head's kind of flopping around a little bit, it gets cumbersome. So I went through so many different, I even was cutting pieces of wood and attaching those, and it dawned on me to try this 3-weight head. And this one's plastic, there's other ones that are metal. I didn't want to get too heavy and exceed that weight limit, the payload capacity. So this Manfrotto geared head is, I think, light enough. I use my 50mm lens, like I said, pretty much all the time now. And even with all this weight and, you know, all the effort it takes to balance it, I can still do 2 to 3 minute, 4 minute exposures, no problem without any star trailing. It just takes a lot of hands-on trial and error.
Is the pano head on top of a ball head? What is the pano head attached to? Is that technically a ball head? No, it's just a declination bracket.
So the pano head is just attached to the, what you want to call it, the bracket that sits on the three-way head. You could use a ball head in lieu of the three-way head. The reason I chose the three-way head is because you can just make super fine adjustments with these knobs. If you're using a ball head, you're going to have to like adjust the whole thing, and it could throw off your polar alignment. You know, it's just less efficient, I guess, is the best way to put it. So when I when I got into this, I went, you know, gung-ho, and I was doing the most complex setup you could imagine. I know this seems super complex, but, you know, tracking mount landscape photography is already super complex. And eventually what I found was like, how can I make this easier? So all I have to do is set up the camera and just make like little adjustments here or there, you know, adjust the field of view with just a nice clean motion. And that's all it is now with the three-way head and this. All I'm doing, you know, is I'll just rotate this a couple hash marks on my pano head, and then I'll start the next exposure. And I'll watch this bubble level. If it gets too far, rotate it a little bit, re-level it, you know. When I'm doing 40, 50 image panoramas with my 50 millimeter lens, let me tell you, the the amount of frustration using this setup is cut by like 90%. Whereas if you're doing those huge panoramas with a ball head and you're like constantly looking through the viewfinder and constantly balancing everything, it gets tiring.
So they also asked, what would you use? Let me say it better. Okay, what do you use instead of the three-way for your longer lenses? And real quickly, the three-way is a Manfrotto 410, but is it the Junior?
Yes, I think the Junior is metal, actually.
So that's
this is the plastic one. I looked at the metal one. My dad had the metal one, and I used the metal one, but it was too heavy. And so this one is like almost all plastic. The actual number on here is MHX Pro 3WG. So this one was a little bit cheaper and substantially lighter. It was like the metal one was like 3 pounds by itself, and this one was like 1.8 pounds or something.
What do you use for longer lenses?
Right. So I don't want to be like the Buzz Killington.
Sir Buzz Killington.
But for longer lenses, so this is my 135 millimeter. When I use the longer lenses, I switch to my telescope mount. Only because I fought for a long time using the 135 on the declination bracket with this guy. So if you're using the longer lenses, what I would do is I would use the actual platform that came with the declination bracket and attach your camera directly to it, or buy a macro focusing rail. So I don't know if you've ever seen a macro focusing rail. It's just a long rail, and it allows you to slide the camera back and forth a little bit. And that helps balance the weight on this bracket. When you're using these long focal length lenses, what happens is this lens has so much glass up here that it pulls the front of the camera down. And so you want to kind of counter that by pulling the camera back on this bracket a little bit. If you don't do that, you'll probably only be able to do 30-second to 1-minute exposures with a lens like this. It's just too heavy. And if you want to go really crazy, I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but I've used a 150 to 600 millimeter lens on both this and the original Ioptron Sky Tracker. I could do a whole workshop on how I made that work.
Right.
So send me an email and I'll give you details on how to use something like that. But that was just a crazy amount of work. I will say though, so if you're using a long focal length and you're curious about auto guiding, the Star Adventure has what's called an ST4 port on here, and you can use what's called a guide camera. A guide camera will sit on top of your DSLR, and the guide camera, what it does is it sees stars. It's not a super long focal length, usually about 100 millimeters, and then it picks a star. Okay, and then the guide camera communicates with software. You'll need a tablet to do this. It communicates with software on a tablet and it says, okay, that star is in that location. It needs to stay within a few pixels of that location. And so if it notices that your tracking mount is not tracking well enough in the RA axis, it tells the mount, okay, speed up just a little bit, slow down just a little bit, and it'll do everything it can to keep that star very centered. And that makes a huge difference if you're doing something like this. So my 135 without the guide scope, the best I could do is probably 2 minutes, maybe 3 minute exposures, and a keeper rate of maybe 50%. With the guide scope and the software, it was basically 100% keeper rate, and I could do up to 4 or 5 minutes. So, but that's a whole nother can of worms that goes way beyond.
Give us a quick list of your custom panorama parts.
Okay, so really the only things that are custom on here is that I've removed the declination platform. It's just a platform that comes attached here. Usually it's right here. And what I've done is I've bought a Manfrotto 3-way geared head. I think Aaron wrote down the model number.
Yep.
And then on top of that, I just bought a cheap Amazon panorama head. I think this costs like $20. I can probably find on my Amazon order the exact model for this, but it's a good aluminum, so it's not super heavy, and it has a clean rotation motion. And then along the pano base are hash marks for degree markings, so I know how much to rotate the camera from exposure to exposure. And that'll depend, if I have it in portrait orientation, I'll only rotate it maybe 1.5 hash marks on the pano head. If I have it in landscape orientation, I can do 3.5 hash marks.
So while you're on that topic, Matt Meisel said you could use or make use of a leveling, let me say this right, leveling base, a leveling head, you know what I mean?
Yes.
That leveling plate. Could you make use of one instead of the Manfrotto 410 Junior? Have you ever thought of it or tried it?
I tried. I guess I'm not that good of an engineer, but you certainly could. If you can, I designed one out of wood and it worked, but ultimately I was, again, farting around with the ball head and all that kind of stuff. And I just wanted something that was, very smooth in terms of its action. But a leveling base would work. I would recommend making one out of like aluminum or something like that. And, you'll have to calculate the angle that you'll need to make this a level, because obviously this doesn't, when this is attached, it's probably like a 30-degree angle or so.
So there's also those leveling heads that you can just grab onto a grip underneath and shift it around.
Yeah.
Those too.
So I did look at those, and none that I could find that cost less than like $4,000, like literally $4,000.
But just because of the payload?
No, it didn't level enough.
Oh.
So most of those leveling bases only did like maybe 15 degrees, 20 degrees at most. And the ones I tried didn't have enough leveling rotation. There are some, like I said, that are like wicked expensive. I can't remember what they're called. There's like a cube one that would work very well, but I just, I didn't have the money, and I'm not going to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on a leveling base when I could just buy this Manfrotto for, I think this cost me like $100.
That's fantastic. The question was asked, do you use a lens warmer? I'm sorry, I jumped Kirk's. Have you thought of an index pano head?
An index panel head. I think I Yes, I have looked at an index panel head. I cannot remember the reason why I did not go with one.
While you're thinking of that, he asked, or Jared asked, do you use a lens warmer?
I use hand warmers because I'm cheap and they weigh nothing. Like I have so much weight on here already. They do make some really nice lens warmers though. And I can certainly send you some links to those. They sell them on Amazon.
While we're talking about in the cold, it was asked by Nathan, how do you keep your batteries in the sub-freezing temperatures from doing terrible performance, terrible efficiency? What do you do?
So the tracking mount, actually, I've used the tracking mount down to -10. I've talked about -10. It was -10 in Bryce when I was down there a couple months
Bryce?
ago. Yeah.
Oh,
and then I shot that picture that he showed with me laying in the snow.
Yeah.
That night was also like -10 or -15.
Looked awesome.
The mount, like those nights, was literally just frozen over, and it still worked. Like I was just blown away.
So the mount batteries never have problems.
No, dude. So this mount uses 4 AA batteries. I replace them maybe like every 3 or 4 months, and Aaron can attest because this thing is filthy. But I have used and abused it. I've gotten every cent out of this tracking mount. The only thing that I do worry about is the camera batteries. And what I do with the camera batteries, usually I'm wearing like a sweatshirt or something, or a heavy coat, and I keep the camera batteries like close to my chest or something, and that keeps them warm. And so when you're doing the tracking exposures and you're taking 2 to 3 minute exposures, like that one picture I did was 40 plus exposures. I probably went through 2 or 3 batteries that night, just because, I mean, the long exposures will kill your battery. And if you're using a Sony, buy a lot of batteries because those things don't last.
Do you do multiple exposures of each field to limit noise?
For stacking?
Well, specifically to do stacking in your panorama.
No.
Okay.
I mean, so you're doing tracking photography, and each exposure is already 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes. I mean, so I do stacking when I do like my deep sky shots. I don't know. I'm sure a lot of people have seen like the shot I did with my 85 millimeter lens. It's like the Milky Way core. And that was, a lot of stacking, but that was 6 panels, and each panel was at least 8 exposures. So, that one picture took me, I don't even know, 6 hours of imaging time. So, if you're shooting at a low ISO and you've stopped down your lens and, you're getting a good signal, you're not going to have a lot of noise. I mean, you're going to look at your tracked exposure and you're just going to be like, it looks like a daytime exposure because it's, so well exposed, as long as you generate a good histogram. Yeah, I think for tracking astrophotography, unless you're doing deep sky imaging stuff, stacking is unnecessary for nightscapes and stuff like that.
Awesome. What ISO for sky and land?
That'll depend on your camera. I would say if you're shooting a Nikon camera, start with ISO 800. If you're shooting a Canon camera, start at ISO 1600. Canons are a little bit tricky. Some of them you could drop to 800, but most of them I would stick with 1600 because unfortunately for Canon, when you shoot at lower ISOs, their sensors have much higher read noise. And so you get better signal to noise resolution or ratio if you shoot at something like 1600. I wouldn't go above 1600. I don't think it's necessary. But 1600 seems like a sweet spot for most Canons.
Will star trackers help with light pollution and battling it?
No.
One good thing is your Andromeda, though, your Andromeda Galaxy situation.
Yeah, I mean, that's a little bit different, right? Like if you're
Yeah.
doing DSO imaging, deep sky object imaging, you're going to have to stack like that Andromeda picture that I think Aaron showed, that was 3 or 4 hours worth of exposure. So you're talking at that point, I've stacked over 100 exposures. So DSO imaging is quite a bit different. I think most people here are going to be focused on nightscape kind of shots with lenses up to 50 millimeters. But if you want tips for like 85 millimeter or 135 millimeter or longer, send me an email.
Cool. Do you still get trailing sometimes with really wide lenses like 14 millimeter?
Sure.
And does it track really well all the way to the edge of the frame?
Nope. So 14 millimeter, you're going to have what's called rotational distortion. This is just the physics of light and lenses. You can't, I mean, it's just unavoidable. You're going to have a lens that is so wide, and I've heard of distortion-free wide-angle lenses. I do not buy it. You're going to have some lens artifacts. And when you're talking about tracking a sky, this whole object is moving. And so light is coming into your lens from all angles. And what ends up happening is as this moves, that's not perfect. Oh. As this moves, the lens is kind of rotating with the sky. And what ends up happening with your image is it's called rotational distortion. So the edge, if you're using like a 12 millimeter or 14 millimeter lens, you're going to see streaking along the edges. And it's just, if you're using a lens that wide, that's just something you have to deal with, I think.
Reflections and water weirdness.
Ha. Yeah. Water reflections is something I've actually talked to physicists about. I've gone so far in this hobby. I've gone to talking to physicists about fixing my problems. So you can imagine, we're tracking something. We're tracking the sky, right? And it's rotating as the Earth rotates. With water, you're dealing with a mirrored environment, and it's mirrored in such a way that you're polar aligned. You can't just flip the rotation of your mount. So like on the Star Adventure, you can switch from northern hemisphere to southern hemisphere, and it alters the rotational, of the RA axis. You can't. It's just it doesn't work that way. And so the only way I've come to figure this out with talking through physicists would be to somehow be able to polar align your mount and then rotate this whole mount 180 degrees and somehow keep it polar aligned once you've rotated it. I just, it sounds great in theory, and I haven't figured out a way how to put it into practice yet. So, hey, if you have ideas. But that's what you'd have to do. You'd have to have it polar aligned, and you'd have to rotate this whole mount 180 degrees and then keep tracking and then take your reflection shots. What I do for reflections now is I just open up the lens to like f1.4, and you can track for 30 seconds or so, but after that, usually you're going to have water motion anyways. So